Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for being with us. This is Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost's final week in office. He announced last month he's stepping down just under 7 months shy of the end of his term to take his job as the Vice President of Strategy for the Christian conservative legal group, the Alliance Defending Freedom. Yost's run as Attorney General would have been over in January, since he could not run for re-election to office because of term limits. He had planned to seek the Republican nomination for governor, but the Ohio Republican Party and President Donald Trump threw support to Vivek Ramaswamy well before the primary election, and so Yost bowed out of that race. To fill the remainder of Yost's term as Attorney General, Governor Mike DeWine has tapped Ohio Department of Public Safety Director Andy Wilson. IdeaStream's State House News Bureau Chief Karen Kassler sat down with Yost recently for an exit interview for her show, State of Ohio, that's on WVIZ PBS. Yost reflected on his quarter century in Ohio politics, why he decided it was time to leave for the private sector, and why this opportunity was the right one for him to make that move. We'll share that conversation with you now, and afterward, Karen Kassler will join me to talk about it. Here you are.
So how long has it been in the works that you were talking to the Alliance Defending Freedom or looking for other opportunities?
Well, I've known that for a long time. I've known the people there for a long time. And it hasn't been a secret that I am going to be out of work come January next year, no matter what happens. So I've actually had multiple people approaching me about doing this or that. And I've declined most of those things. When this came in, I was like, that is the perfect thing for the final chapter in my professional career.
Why is that? I mean, I know that they really deal with issues that you've talked about in office, trans athletes in girls' sports, religious related matters. Why specifically that group?
Well, it's the largest Christian nonprofit in the world. It is also a legal firm. It's also done absolutely amazing work. They've won 18 cases at the United States Supreme Court in the last 15 years. The people there are some of the most brilliant constitutional lawyers in the country, and the opportunity to work with them on First Amendment issues is just outstanding. And, Karen, I hope you'll think beyond the headline of the facts. I mean, the thing that the Supreme Court only takes a few cases every year, and so they tend to be hot button kinds of issues. The thing that attracts me to them is the principles behind them that protect freedom and rights of conscience. And many of the cases that some of my friends on the progressive left or the news media find to be disappointing are actually already being cited in different places by the progressive left to defend their rights of conscience in states that where their views are not popular. That's the idea of the Constitution. It protects all of us in a red state or a blue state, our right to live free. That's ADF's slogan, so that all may live free.
You know there are people on the progressive left, though, that view this as a hate group.
Well, I know that the SPLC, the discredited SPLC, has issued that lie, but I know the people, and I have to say that I have not yet met a hateful person amongst them.
You're leaving in June when your term would end in January. Did you ever consider staying through the end of your term and maybe leaving to go to the Alliance Defending Freedom then?
That was my plan.
Why leave now then?
Because I had this great opportunity and it was time to take it.
But you really had thought that you were going to stay through your whole term.
Yeah. I love this job. I love these people. It's been, all of the goodbyes have been bruises on my heart. You saw my speech Monday. I'm sitting up there thinking, this is the last time I'm going to speak to these people that I've worked with. And, I'm looking out and I recognize her, and I know I've been to her nonprofit. I recognize him, and we've talked about a child rape case that she worked through, and that's not easy.
Well, you also did your last Peace Officers Memorial Ceremony, right, almost at the same time that it was announced that you were leaving. So that was your last one honoring
Of those
police officers who died in the line of duty.
Yeah, and that was a hard day. It's always a hard day, but that one especially.
What will you miss about this job? I mean, obviously, those kinds of things. Is there anything else that you want?
Everything. If I had been allowed to run for a third term, I probably would have, and given the voters a chance to give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. This has been a great job. I've loved the opportunity to every day go out and decide what, to the best of my ability, I believe the right thing to do was, and to pursue it. Your average lawyer doesn't get to do that. Your average lawyer shows up at the office, looks at the files on his desk, and serves the people who paid him to make an argument, whether he thinks the argument's any good or not.
Would you have wanted to see Keith Faber appointed to this position, knowing that there would be potentially this cascading effect through all the statewide executive offices? Was that in the back of your mind when you did decide to leave?
Well, I would not have wanted Keith to be appointed. Now, make no mistake about it, I have supported Keith. I am helping him in his campaign. I think he'll be a great Attorney General. But the electorate is in a foul mood, you might have noticed. And it was my judgment, and I expressed this to the governor when I tendered my resignation, that ascending to the incumbency through an appointment would not help us in a difficult year. And so I think he acted very wisely. And I think Keith is going to be a great AG in January.
Andy Wilson, Department of Public Safety Director, will be stepping in. What's that transition going to be like?
Well, it's already started. I had Andy in to meet with the executive staff. He sat through one of our regular executive staff meetings and participated, got to hear the argument. I have sworn him in as a Special Assistant Attorney General, so he has access to confidential law enforcement information and privileged information as he prepares for taking over on June 8th. We've got a good relationship and have for years. He's a former prosecutor, so Clark County, Delaware County, but we have a lot of commonality in the way we see the world.
Do you get the sense that he's going to go forward with the things that were already in progress? I mean, specifically the First Energy executives retrial in Akron, but other things, do you get the sense that the operations that you started, the lawsuits that you started will continue?
Well, I'll let him speak for himself, but based on several conversations I've had at this point, he wants to do his due diligence and make sure that he believes that things are going in the right direction. But he also recognizes that with 7 months, you can't turn an aircraft carrier on a dime, and so that there's going to be limits to his ability to change everything. I don't doubt he'll make his mark, but I also think that it will largely be in a consistent direction to the one we've had.
You were running for governor and ended up dropping out after Vivek Ramaswamy got the Republican Party's early endorsement. He had already lined up legislative leaders, President Trump. Do you feel that you've been betrayed by the party in some way? Do you have any ill feelings in that area?
I don't have any ill feelings. I support primaries. I support competition. It's kind of funny. Republican politicians in particular love to talk about how competition makes us better. It makes us faster, smarter, cheaper, in our services and our products. And they will preach that until the cows come home, until they might get competition in a primary. And then it's, practically the end of the world and a Judas kiss. I support primaries. I've had a couple in my career, and think that this one would have been helpful to Ohio and to the party. Didn't happen, and I had the trifecta of a billionaire self-funder, a Trump endorsement in a state where he wins by 10 points, and then finally the party ended up following along with him, and it just wasn't meant to be.
But you still consider yourself a Republican? You went from being a never Trumper to being very supportive of President Trump's ideas. You were going to run for governor as a Republican. You were the auditor as a Republican and attorney general as a Republican. You still are a Republican?
I'm still a Republican.
All right. What do you hope your legacy will be, that people will remember your work? I mean, you were a county prosecutor. Again, you were the auditor. You're attorney general. What's your legacy?
If I have a legacy, it will be determined by what follows me and by the people I served. The aggrandizement and arrogance of the political class is one of the things that has gone seriously wrong with our country. And I remember the first time I ever heard about a politician's legacies, worrying about his legacy, was at the end of Bill Clinton's term. You didn't really hear about Ronald Reagan trying to define his legacy, or FDR worried about his legacy. The statesman, the elected leader's job is to be the servant of all, to be the least important, who is working for everybody else. And we've lost that sense of service somehow, and we now have people competing for attention. And I think that it's not that politicians were ever a bunch of selfless, Mother Teresas, but we at least nodded to the idea that humility was a virtue, that we at least nodded to the idea that if you were going to self-promote, you needed to do it softly. Now it's just every day, all day long, everywhere, all at once. And I think that it's rotting the foundation of our society by having a rulership governing class that acts like that. Wow. So that's why I don't want to talk about my legacy. I'm trying to, I don't usually dodge your questions, and I felt I owed you an explanation.
Back now, that was IdeaStream State House News Bureau Chief Karen Kassler in conversation with Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, holding the office for a few more days. Karen is here with me now, calling in from Columbus to talk about Yost's exit from the political stage. If you'd like to join this conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903 or send us an email at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Karen, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Great to talk to you.
Karen, I want to ask you, as you mentioned in the interview, there are people who have questions about the upcoming position that current Attorney General Dave Yost will be taking with the Alliance Defending Freedom. So can you lay out the work of this firm and what's the controversy surrounding it?
Well, like Yost said, it's a very large Christian conservative law firm, and they really take on issues that strike right at Christian conservatives, things like abortion-related cases, religious freedom-related cases, cases involving trans rights and LGBTQ rights. So it's really kind of in the wheelhouse that he's been in for the last couple of years as he's really taken on some of those issues at the state level.
Just a couple things I want to share. He had mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center had some things to say designating this organization as a hate group. The Human Rights Campaign has reported on this as well. So here's what they say. In 2022, this organization has authored more than 130 bills in 34 states. 30 of those became law. Some of those were advocating for making same-sex marriage illegal, some of them for recriminalizing sexual acts among consenting LGBTQ plus adults, banning gender affirming care and also banning trans youth from playing school sports. One other thing to note here, the Human Rights Campaign has called the Alliance Defending Freedom one of the biggest threats to LGBTQ plus equality today. So, Karen, I'll ask you now, was it surprising to you that Yost took this opportunity before the end of his term?
I guess maybe a little bit, because Yost really seems to have enjoyed his time in this office, and he said so. I mean, there was a time when we got almost a weekly press conference from him, because he certainly has been very public about his office's activities, both on the criminal side as well as on the civil side. So in a way, it was a bit of a surprise, but also there was this concern right after it happened that if indeed Governor Mike DeWine would appoint Keith Faber, the Republican nominee for Attorney General, who's the current state auditor, to that office, that would start this domino effect through all of the statewide executive offices, since all of those folks are up for a different office this time around. They're all term limited. And so I had to ask him about that, did that have anything to do with the timing? And he said no, but he also said that he didn't want Faber to be appointed to that position, which I thought was interesting to know, because I think that certainly there were people who would have suspected that politically he would have wanted to see that happen. But he said that actually could have worked against Republicans this year.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because there was some discussion that him leaving this office early could be a shift with leadership at the GOP, and what that would look like if there was someone who was put in that office who would then be running again in November. So he thought that it was a sound policy not to do that. And what did he have to say about the midterm elections related to Republicans?
Well, I think he thought that this is not going to be the best year for Republicans, which we've been hearing nationally. And so the idea of having Keith Faber and all the Owens, Frank LaRose running for auditor, that leaves Secretary of State open. And then you've got Robert Sprague, the treasurer, running for Secretary of State. It moves all of them over. That could be a problem, because Yost said he feels that this is a year that incumbents may not do all that well, that incumbency won't give you any sort of an advantage here. And so, that kind of tracks with some of the things we've been hearing nationally in terms of Democrats having a little bit of an advantage. Of course, Ohio is a very strongly Republican state, so that's something to consider as well. But I think some of his comments about his abandoned race for governor were really interesting, because he said that he thought it would have been good for the Republican Party to have a primary, which would have meant he would have stayed in the race and competed against Vivek Ramaswamy. But he also said that he just couldn't compete with a billionaire who already had two of the biggest endorsements that you can get as a Republican.
So Yost is not the first person to get a few things off their chest when leaving a job, and he did kind of allude to that, or mention it more directly, really, in your conversation with him, being strongly disappointed that the Ohio Republican Party endorsed Ramaswamy before voters could have their say in a competitive primary. What do you think about his candor on that topic?
Very interesting. And Yost has always been somebody who has been good for a sound bite, and he gets a little emotional occasionally. But I thought that was a really interesting moment there, because it clearly meant a lot to him that he was going to run for governor. And I mean, he was in the race before Ramaswamy got into the race. And for the Ohio Republican Party to endorse last year, so a full year and a half before the election, a year before the primary, that really made a difference. And I think it was really, I mean, he didn't say it directly, but it sounds like that was something that really was disappointing to him. And again, he said that he felt like a primary would do the party good. And I think he really felt his ideas would compete against Ramaswamy's ideas. And you did see before the primary some people saying they wish they had a better choice against Ramaswamy than Casey Putsch, who was basically the second place, the second runner-up there in that Republican primary. And Yost, I think, really wanted that opportunity, and he didn't get it.
Now, Yost said early on in your interview, Karen, that this move would be the final chapter in his professional career. Do you think that Yost is definitively closing the door on a return to politics?
Well, I never think that about any of these folks, because a lot of them do want to come back around. They all talk about how they love the job. But Dave Yost is 69 years old, and so that's maybe a factor here. So I don't know. I don't know that he would necessarily want to come back and run for a high office. I mean, he's been at the county level. He served as auditor and attorney general. So the next step arguably is governor, and that door again was closed this time around. So this may be it. And I have to say, as a reporter, I'm going to miss him a little bit because, again, he was always good for a sound bite or two. And he had a way of expressing legal things in pretty straightforward language, and that's always appreciated.
Yost was a journalist. I'm not sure if everyone knows that before entering politics. Do you think that made him more friendly with the media? Cooperative, I'll say?
I think so. It also, I think, made him maybe want to get more media attention. He did a report for the now defunct Columbus Citizen Journal here in Columbus before he moved on to Delaware County, where he was appointed and then elected in office up there. So I think that was part of it. But he did know how to get attention for himself. Again, some of the cases that he would talk about, these press conferences, were big and splashy. He talked about lawsuits that he had filed against Google and Meta, and he had a lot of almost a yearly announcement about a sex trafficking raid. He did do a lot of work in the human trafficking space, and so it was just, and of course the abortion fight, absolutely that became an issue. And people might recall how he got national attention right after abortion was outlawed in Ohio because of Roe versus Wade being overturned. He went on national television disputing the story of a 10-year-old rape survivor who had to go to Indiana to get an abortion, when there are, he as a prosecutor certainly knows that there are 10-year-olds who are raped.
We have a question now along those lines from Todd in Ward 1. Todd, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Please go ahead.
Stephanie, Karen, that's connected to the question that I was posing to the call screener. Did he actually attempt to file charges against the doctor in Indiana where the abortion was done, and the parents for taking the child across state lines to get the abortion? Did Yost actually do that? And if so, did you address that at all in any of your questioning that maybe just didn't make it on air?
Thanks for the question.
I did address that question to him around the time it happened, which had happened in 2022. And I think the Attorney General in Indiana actually did investigate the doctor who did perform that abortion. So, this was a really controversial story, and it happened again right at the same time that Roe versus Wade had been overturned, and there was a trigger law in Ohio that banned abortion, essentially. And so this was a big issue, and for him to talk about this on national television, I asked him in an interview when things started to die down if he owed that girl and her family an apology, and he said he didn't feel that he had anything to apologize for.
Karen, let's talk a little bit more about the election that's coming up right now. The Attorney General's race, obviously, the nomination there ended up going to Ramaswamy, who got the endorsement from Trump. How key is an endorsement from President Donald Trump going to be in the midterms here in Ohio, do you think?
Well, it's already shown to be really, really big. I mean, we've seen it in Indiana. We've seen it in Texas. It's become a big issue. And I think that was part of it. I mean, Yost will tell you that he was endorsed by President Trump as he was running for Attorney General, which is interesting because in 2016, he was a never-Trumper. He really pushed back against Trump, along with then Governor John Kasich and some other folks, but then joined the Trump train, so to speak, as it became clear that Trump was going to be the nominee. And so he actively sought out Trump's endorsement. And at this point, I mean, not only the endorsement from President Trump, but also the endorsement from the Ohio Republican Party, those two things, coupled with Ramaswamy's personal wealth and what he's raised so far, he's done record fundraising already. Yost just could not compete.
You asked Yost about his legacy in this conversation. He basically dismissed the question. Then he circled back, being very critical of politics. So he's clearly got strong feelings about how wealth, for one thing, but also social media have altered politics in his view and the idea of the public servant. So do you think that's connected to how his exit from politics is coming about for him?
I think in a way it was, I wonder if it was not kind of directed at Ramaswamy a little bit, because Ramaswamy certainly had a very public presence on social media for a while and then made it public that he wasn't going to post on social media anymore, though he occasionally pops up now and then. But I thought that was an interesting moment because Yost kind of cut me off, as you heard in the interview, and then said, no, wait a minute, I want to talk about that. And this is a guy who's really enjoyed media attention. And then to talk about that he's concerned that people are prioritizing attention like that over the service that they're doing in their job, I thought was really an interesting thing to say. And I thought that was a moment that was, I think, a little bit honest in that conversation.
So there was time left on Yost's term as we kind of start to wrap things up here, Karen. I want to ask you about the plans, or at least what he might be thinking about in terms of the interim person who will be taking over for the rest of the year, Andy Wilson. There are some things that are going on, some unfinished business. You know, Yost was vocal about making sure to try to retry the first energy executives here in the state of Ohio related to House Bill 6. Do you think that will continue? Are you hearing anything about whether Wilson will take up that mantle?
Well, nobody's speaking about that yet. And Andy Wilson was asked at the press conference where he was introduced as the appointee from Governor Mike DeWine, and he said he's reviewing all the cases. I can't imagine that trial would not continue in September, but I also would imagine that there would be some changes made. So I think that's one of the big ones that we're watching. But I mean, Andy Wilson is stepping into a job that he's only going to be able to do for 6 months or so. And so the impact that he can make there is kind of limited. I wanted to add one more thing that when you talk about Dave Yost, you quite often have to talk about how he's a musician. He plays piano, he plays guitar, he sings, he's performed at rallies, he's performed at the Republican National Convention. And so at the end of the interview, I didn't include this part, but I asked him, so is it a requirement that whoever takes over for this job has to be musical? And he said, no, but I hear Keith Faber plays a great washboard, which was an interesting comment.
I play the triangle pretty well, Karen, as well. Any final thoughts on Yost's departure?
Well, I think he's been one of the more colorful people to cover in state politics because, you know, these statewide executive offices, Attorney General, Auditor, Secretary of State, and Treasurer, are incredibly important. Attorney General gets the most attention out of those, though Secretary of State kind of competes for that. And so it's interesting to have somebody in that position who you kind of enjoy covering in the sense that you know you're going to get a story out of him, you know it's going to be explained. And for us here in broadcasting, it's nice to get somebody who can explain it neatly and concisely so that we can put it in our newscasts.
That is very true. Idea Stream's State House News Bureau Chief Karen Kassler, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Great to be here.
You can hear Karen and the State House teams work daily on 89.7 WKSU, and you can watch The State of Ohio Sundays at noon on WVIZ PBS. You can also find past episodes on the Ohio Channel website. We'll take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll look at a new study from Case Western Reserve University linking climate change to an increase in cases of heart disease. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. We'll be right back. You're with The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us. As summer temperatures start to climb across much of the country, researchers are taking a closer look at what that could mean for public health. Extreme heat can increase the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and other serious cardiovascular events, particularly among older adults and people with existing heart conditions. A new study from Case Western Reserve University, University Hospitals, and the Cleveland Veterans Affairs Medical Center projects that as climate change leads to more frequent extreme heat events, heat-related heart disease could increase by 200% nationwide over the next 25 years. Today, we'll talk with two of the researchers behind the study about what they found, who could be most effective, and what could be done to reduce the risks. Joining me in studio, we have Gokul Paramaswaran, Research Associate with the Cardiovascular Research Institute at Case Western Reserve University's School of Medicine. Gokul, welcome.
Thank you.
We also have Dr. Salil Dio, Associate Professor in the Department of Surgery at Case Western Reserve University's School of Medicine. Hi, Salil. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
If you want to join the conversation, you can call us at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Now, let's talk about the connection between heat and heart disease. Salil, I'll ask you first. How does extreme heat put strain on the cardiovascular system?
Many studies have shown that when the temperature increases above an optimal temperature or the most convenient temperature, various changes occur in our bodies, such as increase in the heart rate and especially dehydration. That is, we sweat more to be able to maintain our temperature and our inner body core temperature. That leads to increased stress on the heart. Of course, this does not affect everyone across the board. I think we need to understand that especially vulnerable people such as the elderly, those with pre-existing stroke, pre-existing heart disease are more at risk of this happening. It also can result in sludging of the blood in the smaller capillaries, for example, in the brain and the heart, which can then lead to a stroke or heart attack.
Okay, so something that you looked at in order to guide this research, Gokul, I'll ask you about this, is the Global Burden of Disease database. So can you tell us about that and how that helped guide this research?
Yeah, so in this study, what we really wanted to do was try to capture not only mortality, but also the morbidity. So not just look at deaths, but also the sort of impact that it has on people in terms of like the disability and other problems associated with heart disease. So that data is actually very difficult to come by in a very granular way. So the Global Burden of Disease is basically a worldwide database where they're able to estimate in pretty granular detail. So for the US, it's all the data is available at state level. But for even countries where there's quite a lot of sparsity in health data, they've managed to compile quite a lot of information about the health of those populations. So we basically looked at that database and downscaled it to the level of a county in order to do very granular research, thinking about how different temperatures at the level of the county can have significant health consequences.
And it's my understanding you looked at data from 2010 to 2016, is that right, to project out to what might happen in 2050? Can you tell us a little bit about how you're able to make that leap from there all the way out to 2050?
Sure, yeah. So 2010 to 2016 was just our baseline period. So we needed to take like a multi-year mean because, you know, you might have some fluctuations and temperature is something that is very volatile by definition. So then we wanted to look at sort of two different time points to see how that's going to change. So different sort of modeling centers and essentially space organization and meteorological weather projections agencies around the world have climate models that take into account a lot of different factors. So for our study, we looked at 5 different models from all over the world. So we focused on the American model because we were focusing on the US. So they have like climate and temperature projections for 2030 and 2050. So instead of kind of having the inputs for 2010 to 2016 in our model, we used the inputs that they provided for 2030 and 2050 in order to model the impact of different climate conditions that we might experience in the future and how that might influence our health.
Okay. Now, Salil, your team analyzed data county by county across the United States, as we just kind of broke down there. Were there geographic patterns that stood out to you?
I think our results were notable for two maybe important facts. One is that we saw at baseline that maybe the Pacific Northwest is most likely to have a higher present burden of cardiovascular disease due to heat. The reasons we think that we saw in our analysis that this might be so is because in each location there is something called TMREL, or the most ambient temperature. That is the temperature that our body is most used to. And we found in our analysis of data from 2010 to 2016 that the Pacific Northwest had lower ambient temperature, or comfortable temperature that we can define as. Therefore, any increase above that increase the risk of heart disease for those people.
That's interesting, and that sort of seems like it might make more sense to me now that you explain it that way, because when I think of the Pacific Northwest, I think of it being cooler and rainy, but you're saying that those people, those bodies have gotten used to that, so the increase will be more starkly felt?
Exactly, and therefore whenever we talk about temperature and we talk about modeling temperature, we talk about percentile rather than the degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius in that location. Because when we live in a particular location, slowly our bodies adapt to that. We also adapt to that by changing our behavioral patterns. And therefore, I think it's important for us to understand that if we are used to living in Northeast Ohio and then we move to Arizona, we will definitely feel much more impact of the heat initially till we adapt to that.
Even though it's a dry heat, as they like to tell us. There's a
so-
little bit of a joke there.
I think that, but in all seriousness, I think that's also an important point because humidity can also play a factor in the way we perceive temperature. In more humid locations, we tend to sweat less, and so our internal temperature increases. And ultimately, the effects that happen on the body are due to the internal temperature increase that we can face.
Okay. If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about a new study from Case Western Reserve University and partners about climate change and how climate change is projected to potentially impact an increase in heat-related heart disease over the next 25 years by 200%. If you want to be a part of this conversation, you can call us at 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Gokul, let me ask you a little bit about the southern states and what's projected there in your results that you saw in this study. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we were actually pretty surprised because the South is, we think of it as being very hot. So when I was doing the study, I expected that bit to be kind of face the largest burden at baseline. But as Salil was saying, at baseline, we actually found that the South isn't the sort of region with the highest heat-related heart disease. So in the context of the projections, though, what we find is that the South is actually warming up the fastest. And there's three kind of colliding factors that make the South maybe the most vulnerable region to facing heat-related heart disease going forward. So firstly, the South and the southern states face the largest cardiovascular disease burden in the United States. Secondly, as I said before, that region of the US is warming up faster than the rest of America. And then thirdly, that region is also among the socioeconomically sort of most vulnerable in the US and have the maybe poorest healthcare infrastructure in a sort of like macro level. And as a result of these three colliding factors, they've been left very vulnerable to the impact of the rapid shifts that we're seeing in climate change and how that can kind of place stress on the body and influence different health outcomes.
Can we talk a little more specifically about the lower income states and how that's likely to impact health outcomes?
Yeah, so climate change and a lot of environmental factors, by definition, very strongly kind of affect the most vulnerable people in our communities. So a lot of these people might not have stable homes. There's more like outdoor work. So if you're an agricultural worker, for example, you roughly experience about 35-fold an increased risk of having a heat-related death than somebody who doesn't work outdoors. So a lot of these kinds of communities are in the southern US. And as a result, their vulnerability and potential challenges that they face due to the rapid shifts in climate patterns is very significant compared to someone who maybe lives in New York City or Boston or some other sort of big metropolitan area in the north.
Salil, can you tell us a bit more, just kind of lay out for us the actual impacts on the body, what will actually happen that will lead to increased heart disease with climate change increasing?
I think that as climate change increases and then as the earth warms up and temperature increases, if we do not adapt to it or we do not try to adjust our behavioral patterns, we may end up as a population, on a societal level, having higher burden of heart disease due to this increased warming. What we need to understand in our study and when we study the environment is that although the effect on each individual person may be small, as a society the burden is very large. And when we do these studies and these sort of analyses, we want to understand what is the burden to a population, a society, a region, a country, and the nation.
And as we think about that and think about what we can potentially do about this, we've got an email in now from Tom. Tom writes, our economy is a system based on constant expansion in all areas: food, population, production, and profit. This system leads to pollution, war for resources, and occasional pandemics and famines. Tom goes on to write, this system, based on the myth of infinite resources on a finite planet, can only lead to our eventual, gradual, inevitable extinction. The increase of heart disease is a symptom of our extinction. We must choose to live a different way and prioritize our planet in all of our policies. And Salil, I think that might be what you were kind of starting to talk about there. So can you talk to us about some of the solutions mentioned in the study that could potentially make this a different result?
Sure. So I think there are solutions for this, and I think we have to think of solutions at the personal level and at the societal level. At the personal level, I think we have to think about how we can adapt to the increasing temperature and change our behavioral patterns by maybe doing more activities outside during the early mornings or late evenings when it is not as hot outside. At the societal level, I think it maybe we can incorporate certain alarm systems or which alert us to when the temperature is extremely hot or when heat waves are expected to occur in our region. Also, there are various states which are incentivizing the use of air conditioning, and Medicaid is supporting that. I think these are all important policies which we need to think of and which will help to reduce the effect of warming in our society.
Gokul, do you want to talk about some of maybe the community planning things that could potentially come into play here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that we can do. So firstly, we can try to build like cooling centers and things like that. So especially thinking about sort of vulnerable populations where having an AC or even having like a home may not necessarily be practical, having a sort of like public cooling center that you can go to if it's extremely hot, where it's kept cold by having like lots of air conditioning units, that might be something that's helpful. Then from like a housing and more sort of urban infrastructure planning, so greening and having sort of urban trees and that sort of thing, and parks and green spaces, that's also something that's well linked and associated with reducing the temperature and actually reducing the heat-related health burden and cardiovascular burden specifically. So another thing that's also been found to be quite effective in Arizona, which does face quite a lot of sort of heat-related health problems, is having like an early warning system. So if you live in Ohio, for example, you've probably had tornado warnings and hurricane warnings and that sort of thing. So similar to that, if there's going to be an extreme temperature or a heat wave, sending people warnings so people are aware and can plan appropriately, make sure they're well hydrated, stay indoors, especially if they're sort of elderly or more vulnerable. All of those things can be really helpful at a community level.
So, Lil, I want to ask you about something that you said. A quote from you is that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a health equity crisis. What does that mean in practical terms?
I think that it is inevitable. So firstly, I think we say that change is the only constant. That means our world is always changing, and we have to adapt to that in a good manner. The temperatures are going to increase, and therefore I think it is important for us to preempt that and to work together as a community or as a society to try to reduce the risk for all members of the society. That may mean having various plans at the local or the federal level, which would help to support the less affluent community members.
Okay. Gokul, what do these findings mean for healthcare systems? Are hospitals and public health agencies prepared for the kind of impact your research is projecting?
At least in my opinion, no, I don't think the healthcare community is fully aware of the impact of these sorts of climate-related consequences on health. And I think a lot more sort of investment and planning can be done within the healthcare systems. So what do I mean by that? I think there's sort of two levels to think about it. So, firstly, from sort of an individual clinician standpoint, I think we can think about maybe whether medications we prescribe can affect thermoregulatory balance. So, for example, a lot of people might be on antihypertensive medications, so things like beta blockers and lots of other drugs as well. So, a lot of these different medications can actually influence how our body perceives heat, as well as our body's ability to kind of regulate our temperature as well. So, if it's going to be a very hot summer, then potentially when you're going to see your doctor for any reason, they could potentially think about reviewing some of those medications or altering those doses based on a lot of other risk factors as well. So that's one example. We can also counsel patients a bit more and tell them that, extreme temperature is a risk factor like poor dietary habits or smoking or other things that, the general public might be more aware of. So then from a healthcare infrastructure point of view, so one thing that's kind of been well documented is when we have an extreme weather event, be that extreme heat or extreme cold, we see an increase in heart attacks. We see an increase in other sort of acute emergencies. So I think one thing that's been suggested more of is kind of integrating those weather patterns and climate projections with with the actual healthcare system. So for example, if we're projecting and we're predicting a heat wave, then you can sort of prepare the hospital for the fact that you might have more admissions, have more staff, have more emergency ambulances working, that sort of thing.
It's interesting what you said about how our medications might interact with the environment around us. We'll go to a pharmacy oftentimes, and the pharmacist will tell us, if you're taking this medication, it might interact with this medication in this way, but we don't necessarily think about our environmental factors in the same way, and maybe that's a mindset shift that this research might lead to. Salil, you were talking a bit about personal responsibility. Can you give us any examples of what you think might be beneficial steps for people to take to become more personally responsible for the greater community when we think about the impacts we might see?
I think that as we live together in society, we need to maybe make small changes in our behavioral patterns, which may help to reduce the possible increase in temperature that we may face. That may be, in a way, thinking of trying to reduce our own carbon footprint in the form of maybe flight travel or something like that, which has a large carbon footprints, I think.
When we think about this research and what you hope will come from it, Gokul, I'll ask you. So you put this research together. This is something that piqued your interest in some way. I'll ask you that first. What was it that got you interested, Gokul, in researching this particular topic?
So I think for me, a couple of things interested me about this area. So I think the first thing is a lot of environmental factors, and temperature especially, is something we all experience. And it's not something that we conventionally think about in terms of how we evaluate risk. So much of medicine has focused on sort of behaviors that we can change, smoking, the amount we drink, exercise, diet, that we kind of neglect things like pollution, temperature, and the urban environments we live in. So I think I found that angle very compelling. And then secondary to that, I think I also found it really interesting to see how we can kind of think about temperature from a clinical standpoint, but also from a wider policy and societal thing. And that thing of different ideas kind of intersecting when we think about how we mitigate against this, I found very interesting.
And for you, Salil, what made you interested in researching this?
I think at the environment, like Gokul says, when we are healthcare providers, and therefore we mainly try to think about conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, which we know greatly affect cardiovascular health, but very often we don't think as much about the environment and what surrounds us. And we are gradually finding that noise, light pollution, green space, air, components of air pollution and temperature, they are having increasingly larger effect on our body and our health. And we need to be cognizant of that so that we can live healthy lives.
Well, thank you both for being here and helping bring attention to the research that you've done here on this. Dr. Salil Deo, Associate Professor, Department of Surgery with the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much.
And Gokul Paramaswaran, Research Associate, Cardiovascular Research Institute at the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you, Gokul.
Thank you so much.
That's all the time we have today. If you missed any part of today's show, you can hear a rebroadcast tonight at 9 on 89.7 WKSU. You can also find every episode of The Sound of Ideas wherever you get your podcasts and on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page. To get the last word on today's topics, email us at soi@ideastream.org or find us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Yesterday, we talked about University Circle Incorporated's plan to better connect the district, and Emily sent us this. I live in Concord Township in Lake County now, but as a child, I grew up in South Euclid, and we would regularly drive down to University Circle to enjoy all the cultural offerings. One institution I haven't heard mention is the Cleveland Music School Settlement, where my sister and I took music lessons for years. We loved this old mansion turned music school. It gave us the feeling that we are part of Cleveland's history. I know they are doing important work to improve accessibility to the arts for local residents. Thank you for that reminder, Emily. I just recently learned that the Music Settlement offers musical summer camps for adults, including steel drum for beginners. You can check that out at themusicsettlement.org. Tomorrow on The Sound Ideas, we'll talk about gun violence prevention efforts with city leaders in Cleveland and Akron. We'll talk through safety measures like locks and safes and programs that keep children involved in extracurricular activities when school is out for summer. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for keeping the conversation going. We will see you back here tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas. Have a wonderful day, everybody.